Welcome to Enlightenment Strikes, a podcast brought to you by Saving Cities. I'm Jack Storey, and in each episode, a member of our team is going to host a conversation with an expert in a place-related field. That could be anything from accessibility to zoning and everything in between. Today's guest is one of the fiercest advocates for pedestrian safety. She's also the author of the recently released Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Death in America, Angie Schmitt. Angie is also the founder of 3MPH Planning and Consulting, which tackles these kinds of critical issues on the ground level. So let's get to it. Okay, so thank you again for doing this, Angie. And I wanted to start by saying, and I emailed you this, the book is absolutely brilliant and infuriating. And I found it particularly heartbreaking on a couple of different fronts. And I thought the stories of loved ones being killed by the traffic violence, they're appropriately hard to read. And it's impossible not to get emotional about that. But the other side of the heartbreak was absolutely about how common sense and cost effective the solutions seem to be,
Yeah.
with no sense of urgency to address that. And I want to start by talking a little bit about how you even get to writing about a topic like this. And
Yeah.
that seemed like a fair place to start.
Yeah.
Okay.
First of all, that's so nice. It's just getting out there and hardly anyone has read it. So that's really awesome. I've been like a little bit anxious about what
I
people
bet.
think of it. But so I started writing it about 2 years ago. For a long time, I had sort of a weird job where I was telecommuting to New York. I worked for an organization called Streets Blog. That's a nonprofit. And our mission was reporting on basically biking, walking, and transit, and trying to promote more sustainable alternatives to everyone just jumping in a car every time they have to go anywhere, right? It's actually a really difficult political battle. And like I mentioned, they're based in New York, where there has been a lot of progress, and it's been a sort of a political issue in that city. So I worked for them for about 9 years, and just covering day in and day out this stuff, this transportation stuff. And so I had like just a lot of knowledge. I just started 9 years is a long time to
It's a
cover
long
something
time.
as a writer, especially there's hardly anyone like at newspapers anymore that covers transportation, just because the media has shrunk. And so at one point, and I had like two really young kids, and I was working full time, but I was spending a lot of time in the evenings, like on social media. And I was like, I could just take this time and write a book and like get some of this stuff out, instead of wasting my time on social media. And I didn't end up writing it all like in the evenings when my kids were asleep. But that's sort of how I got started.
And you brought it up a little bit. You have a journalism background. And I noticed a fun gap when I was checking you out online between your undergrad and your grad degrees. Your undergrad is in journalism and poli-sci, yes?
Yeah.
And then you immediately went into reporting. Was that the plan? Were you always planning to
Um,
go and report?
Not always. I didn't actually. My mom used to do PR, and I actually was one of those kids that like I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. Like when I arrived at college, I was like I was interested in a lot of things. I didn't have like a clear plan, and it took me a long time to figure that out. But so I studied journalism, and I just thought, well, I'll do communications or something. But
Sure.
then I started. I had to write for the Lantern at OSU, and I got onto this interesting story, and that led to. I actually started out in Columbus. I worked for the suburban newspapers. I got offered like a stringer position there when I was in college, and then after I graduated, they said, "Why don't you come work for us full time?" And it was just kind of a fun job. I liked it. So then I was trying to sort of move up in newspapers, and eventually I worked at the Toledo Blade. But then the recession came, and I was like, I want to transition out of um, reporting and start doing planning. So I got a master's degree in urban planning, but then I sort of got sucked back into it with the Streets blog position. And what I was doing at Streets blog was like a little bit of a mix of both. Like, well, it was mostly reporting, but having like a planning background
Right.
um, made it a good fit.
And so what drove you to planning? What was the catalyst for that? That's a pretty, as we've all come to learn when we play in that field, it's a really weird place to decide to end up. Especially if that wasn't where you were heading in the first place.
Yeah, so I actually covered I covered a lot of planning efforts when I was a reporter. Like when I was reporting on suburban places, I actually covered Westerville, which north of Columbus they basically took a greenfield area and turned it into like an enormous corporate office park, sort of.
Mm,
They were in the middle of that while I was there, and now there's probably more than 10,000 jobs there now, including shoot, I forget. Some big employers like Chase Bank, I think Amazon, maybe. It's really reshaped the whole Columbus region in some ways that are not so great. I think a lot
yeah.
of sprawl up to the north as a result of that. But anyway, they had like I used to covering planning was a big part of my beat when I was there, and then I actually worked in Youngstown for a while. That was like I was from Columbus, and I was like I want to go do some reporting and the place that's different and a daily newspaper, and I ended up working in Youngstown for a year. And they had a so there I was covering the city as opposed to the suburbs, and they had a plan that was considered really groundbreaking there. It was called Youngstown 2010, and it was about planning for shrinkage because Youngstown had lost so much population.
Right.
And it was like they had a mayor that was sort of like a star mayor. He went to work for the Obama administration named Jay Williams. So I was really interested in covering that there. And it's long story short, I'm like just rambling, but I also in Toledo, I was back covering the suburbs. And one thing I thought was sort of upsetting was just the level of inequality in Ohio between the suburbs and the cities and the central cities like Toledo, Youngstown, Columbus to like a lesser extent. But I thought it was really sort of unjust and that public policy played into it in a lot of ways, that it was sort of rigged a little bit for the suburbs. So that's how I got interested in it. And I thought, well, I'll just take some of this research background I have and try to get involved with that and try to help.
And so I know you from about a decade ago, somehow magically 10 years has gone by, where you were a huge advocate for alternative transportation and mass transit. And so the fact that you wrote this particular book is not all that surprising to me. But what was the pivot? It's a small pivot, but there was something different between talking about biking or busing and tackling this very specific topic, um,
Yeah.
of pedestrian related incidents.
Yeah. So day in and day out, I was writing about these issues, and there's been a lot of attention to bicycling. I think bicycling it's sort of how I got interested in it. It's how a lot of people you start like biking to work, and all of a sudden you're like radicalized, and you're like cars are the devil, and because there's like a lot of conflict in it. It's very high stakes for you, right? So that was got a lot of attention, but several years ago there started to be this escalation in deaths for pedestrians and also cyclists, sort of not as strong of a pattern with cyclists, but there is some of that going on for cyclists too. And I just thought it was sort of underexplored, and I thought it was really unjust. Like there's about 10 times as many pedestrians that get killed every year as cyclists. But there wasn't the same kind of support for them, and I think it goes back to like one of the themes of the book is sort of inequality, and it goes back to sort of who's getting killed and their like position in the social hierarchy, and that's one of the reasons I think it's been a little bit overlooked. A lot of the people that get killed are um, less powerful socially, a little bit more marginalized than like commuter cyclists, right?
Right. So let's talk. So let's talk about the politics for a little bit, because I think it's foundational to the narrative that I think you were telling, and then also just to the solution is going to be found through policy and infrastructure. It sounds a lot like that's the case. And you talk about these things called Vision Zero initiatives, and I know there's one particular one that started that all off. What first can you explain Vision Zero, but then what in the world would compel someone not to advocate for that or to actively oppose it?
Yeah, so Vision Zero is this concept that comes out of Sweden. And just a totally different way of looking at traffic deaths. So in the United States, our sort of MO has been, okay, let's say we had 38,000 traffic deaths last year, which is about what we had in the United States. Our goal, like the US DOT will set a goal to do maybe like 5% better the next year. So we'll aim for 35,000, and if we succeed at only 35,000 deaths, we'll pat ourselves on the back and say we saved 3,000 lives, right? So
Yikes.
this real like baseline acceptance of traffic deaths as part of life and inevitable, right? And I still think that's like the dominant framework through which Americans look at the problem. But in Sweden, they there was this there's a gentleman who was in charge of transportation there, and he proposed something different. He said it's immoral to look at these deaths and injuries as just like part of the price we pay for mobility,
Right.
right?
Right.
And he said he instead of like in the United States, there's a tendency to blame either the driver or the pedestrian, but he said the system designers, the engineers have a responsibility in this too. So this concept has really been it's been really revolutionary. It's been embraced by different countries around the world and in many US cities as well now. So cities like New York, Portland, Seattle are taking this pretty seriously and have had some success. But I still think it's a big evolution, and we're definitely not fully there yet as a culture.
And what would the opposition be to? You mentioned a few examples of just it's just not a priority, obviously. But then when it gets brought up, how can it? What is your thoughts or your opinion, having done all this research on what compels someone to ignore it or to oppose it? From a political perspective, it seems to me anyway that there's nothing but positive gain from implementing
Yeah.
something like this.
Yeah. I think first of all, I think our whole culture around driving is very just like fucked up. Excuse my
No, 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 of
language.
course.
But there's like this very zero sum mentality. It's like dog eat dog. I need to get in front of this car on my way to work to save. And it's sort of it's really harmful. Like I think everyone thinks of it as being harmless, and that I think we come to driving sort of like with the totally wrong mentality. It should be about getting somewhere safely. Instead, it's about like how can I save 26 seconds on my 11-minute drive or whatever. And I think there's so many things that go into it culturally. It's part of it is the system designers, the engineers. That's been the focus. Like, let's save people a few minutes on their 30-minute commute, and that's going to be the end goal of our transportation efforts. That's a big part of the problem. But like, there's car culture, the car commercials, car chases in movies, all these things sort of shape the way we view the issue. And it leads to, and it all seems harmless. Like you seem like such a scold or like such a goody two shoes, like objecting to car chases in movies, right? That's like so American. Nobody questions that, but it really
Sure.
does impact the way people behave and leads to really tragic outcomes. I think 'cause car chases do not turn out good in real life. There's a lot of innocent bystanders that get hurt. And people just aren't exposed to that too much, aren't exposed to the reality of it.
Right. And you talking quite a bit about low and moderate income neighborhoods bearing a disproportionate level of these unfortunate accidents or traffic violence moments. And
Yeah.
we talk a little bit about, I mean, it seems it's a common sense thought process, right? But those places that are least invested in would obviously suffer a higher rate, but that is not just conjecture, right? That is factual.
Yeah.
You
No,
found
that's true.
so much that goes into that. Can you break down a couple of those things?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have the exact data right in front of me, but Black men are about 2 times more likely to be killed while walking as white men, and similar for Latino men. So, and men are at higher risk than women. There's a lot of different ways like identity plays into this. So, what's going on with that? Why are people of color, a native men in particular, are suffer the worst rates of injury and fatality? So, what's going on with that? And so, part of it is Black people, Hispanic people are doing more walking. We know like they're more likely to rely on the bus because of the wealth gap. They may have financial obstacles to car ownership because of segregation. They may already live in areas that are a little more friendly to transit, et cetera. Okay. So that's part of it. But another part of it is there's a level of systemic racism that's in play. And there's a guy named Charles Brown who has been doing some speaking with me. He's a researcher at Rutgers, and he wrote the foreword to my book. He says that when white neighborhoods, have a safety concern, they're able to get safety improvements. They have like the political
Right.
capital, especially if they're wealthy, to get pedestrian island or a crosswalk in a lot of cases. In some cases, it's still difficult because it's a really tricky issue politically. But in Black neighborhoods, they're more likely to just get enforcement. And that ends up being police coming out and ticketing people for jaywalking, which is not effective for safety, for increasing safety, and has some cascading problems with. You could have it's ripe for police brutality. We've seen that happen in a lot of cases. And also the fines can end up trapping people in this cycle of dependency where they have these sort of cascading legal issues that pile up.
And one of the things that right in the beginning of the book you talked about that I didn't know is that no matter if it's marked or not, they're all legal crosswalks. Like crosswalks aren't just defined crosswalks that you can visually see.
Yeah.
I had no
No
idea
one,
that was true.
yeah, no one really, it's sort of interesting. So no one really understands jaywalking rules correctly. Even police that enforce them. Like I talk about a little bit in the book, there's this case down in Jacksonville where some reporters really dug into like who's getting ticketed for jaywalking, what's the outcome, and they went back and examined the cases, and they could tell like in a third of cases, people that were fined for jaywalking were not jaywalking because the police didn't understand that legally speaking, every intersection is considered a crosswalk, whether it's marked or not. There is one exception to that. It's a little bit confusing, but in most cases, every intersection is considered an unmarked crosswalk. So a lot of people don't understand that. And even when a pedestrian gets killed, there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on in the news, and they'll be like, well, that person wasn't in a crosswalk, but actually the reporter probably doesn't even know, they may have been in a crosswalk, technically speaking or legally speaking, even though there weren't stripes there in the road.
Right. So that's a good way to kind of, I think, segue into the overall infrastructure conversation, right? Because another couple of things that you spend a decent amount of time talking about are speed, which is the obvious, lighting, which I found a little less obvious, and was really fascinating to me. And then obviously kind of sidewalk having sidewalks, and then also having maintained sidewalks, and the importance of those infrastructure components um, in promoting healthier outcomes for this particular thing. Of those, not crosswalks, but the rest of those, what do you think is the most important thing we could do infrastructurally um, right now?
So it depends a little like on the location. I don't think there's always like one silver bullet thing. Yeah, I was
Sure.
doing this thing with another guy, so I'm sort of taking credit for what he said. But he said, things that slow down speed, anything that's going to slow down speed is going to benefit pedestrians. So there's a lot of tools that planners have that can do that. But I also think one of the things I think is my big thesis coming out of this book is so like on a highway, if you're on a highway, they make sure you have everything you need to be safe. They don't leave off like a concrete barrier to save money, or they don't leave off a sign or stripes in the road to save money. For drivers, especially for those highway commuters, they really make sure whatever you need is in place, right? And often they'll, like in the city of Columbus, they just spent like $1 billion reworking all the interchanges around downtown because they said it was a safety issue, right? $1 billion. So, like an enormous sum. And that's not that unusual anymore for a state government to spend $1 billion on an interchange. In Columbus's case, it's a little bigger than a single interchange. They end up being these behemoth projects. But anyway, I'm digressing. On roads all over the United States where people walk, where people ride the bus, there's missing pieces of infrastructure, missing pieces of basic safety infrastructure that people need to be safe. If you're a person who uses the wheelchair, for example,
Right.
and there's no curb cut where you need it, you may end up having to roll along in the street, which raises obvious safety problems. Or if you are a person who rides the bus in an area where the bus only comes once every half hour and there's no bus shelter, you may decide it makes sense to wait across the street, like under an awning at a business. And then when the bus comes, you're racing across the street. So that raises a safety issue. So those are the kind of things. You brought up streetlights as well. 75% of pedestrian fatalities occur at night. So, and I think this is one of the things that goes back to inequality. If you're like a wealthier white person, maybe you can take for granted that streetlights are going to be working, and maybe you don't even find yourself in the position to be walking at night in the first place, right?
Absolutely.
But that's not the case for everyone. That's not the case in some of the poorer neighborhoods that have been formerly redlined.
And you were talking about, and forgive me, was it Detroit or was it Seattle?
Yeah, Detroit. Well,
Okay.
actually, both. There's examples for streetlights in both. Um, Sorry though.
No, 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 that's okay. So that I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that example, the particular example. I think it was Detroit that was most.
Yeah, yeah. So like Detroit, I use as one of the success stories in my book, and it actually wasn't really even about pedestrian safety, but around about 2014, I believe, they did a survey and they determined that about 40% of the streetlights in Detroit were not functioning. They had burned out or just, whatever, weren't working. So, but it's a sort of a big success story because the state got together with the city. They issued $185 million in bonds and they got them all fixed. They got them all working. Now they're all LED, right? And immediately pedestrian deaths dropped like 40% in Detroit. And there was a group that was tracking it. And the deaths that occurred in dark, unlighted positions went down to practically zero. So that issue of street lighting is really important, and I think has been overlooked somewhat by the planning community, which has been more focused on things like bike lanes.
Sure. Yeah, that was a fascinating. That got stuck in my head for a bunch of days. Um, just because there's so many benefits, obviously, to lighting,
Yes,
security
yes,
in general, but um,
yes,
to have that kind
yes.
of significant number percentage of drop, that is insane. And then
Yeah, and that's in the context of when it's growing throughout the state and throughout the country. Pedestrian deaths elsewhere are growing like
right.
40 or 50% over the same period. So it's better than it sounds.
which again is weirdly heartbreaking and infuriating.
Yeah.
But you got to celebrate the little bits, right? So
Yeah.
that the other thing that came out of that kind of why things are rising was one of the core reasons is the size and weight of vehicles. Another thing that I would never have thought about quite the same way. Um, and then you have a picture in the book that is of 17 children piled in front of a Chevy Tahoe, um, trying to showcase how many kids could fit in front of one of those vehicles before they would even see them.
Yeah, the front blind zones on some of these SUVs and pickup trucks are enormous. You could fit, I think actually the group that did that photo, they could only get 17 permission from 17 kids' parents, but they could have fit like 53 kids, all just sitting in front of this. That's sort of like a full-size SUV. So that's sort of there's a lot of visibility and safety issues with SUVs and pickups. And I myself, even though I was writing about this day in and day out, did not sort of put two and two together on that until probably around 2015. And I think I was sort of the first reporter to say, wait a second, there seems to be a connection here because so after the last recession, there was a big change in the auto market where we went from mostly driving or mostly selling sedans to now 73% of cars being sold in the US are either pickups or SUVs, right? We've had this
Right.
big growth in crossovers. And since I first started pointing that out, there's been a lot of data that has come out that says pretty conclusively that SUVs are a lot more dangerous than sedans for pedestrians. Pedestrians are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed if they're hit by an SUV than by a regular sedan. And the reason for that is they're bigger and they're heavier, but also the front ends are so much higher. They're hitting people higher on the body. Like a 1993 Honda Civic, might have hit someone like me in the shins or the knees, right? Instead, what they were replacing that with, an HRV or whatever, is going to hit me in the hips, maybe. And that's a lot worse injury, sort of for obvious reasons.
That is, yeah. So I'm trying to think of the way to frame this because driver safety is obviously a huge component of the safe driving, rather, um, is a hugely important part of this narrative. But there's also just something about not knowing what you don't know about the size and weight and capacity of your vehicle in a moment. And I thought that SUV argument was really interesting around just, I don't think about that. I would never think about that while driving. And
Yeah.
I do drive a bigger vehicle. And
Yeah.
now for the last week of running errands, I have been very, very conscious of my surroundings just based on reading that little bit in a book, right? And I think that speaks to the importance of what you're trying to do. Um,
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of so like during the Obama administration, they had finally proposed since the Ralph Nader days, like since the 70s, since the 60s, and even before, they've talked about but have never done any vehicle regulations specifically to protect pedestrians. There's like hundreds of vehicle regulations about, airbags and semi-automatic brakes, blah 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 blah. Windshields. There's specifications about windshields and how they should deform, but anyways, there's never been any vehicle regulations to protect pedestrians. I think again that goes back to like the status of the people getting killed. But during late in the Obama administration, he had proposed at least rating cars based on pedestrian impact, so they would have got 1 to 5 stars.
Interesting.
And then at least people would have been informed because you're right. Like we don't even tell people, hey, you're buying a Ford F-250. You should know this is more dangerous to pedestrians. Whether people would care,
Yeah,
who
yeah, yeah,
knows? But
sure.
That's another part of the problem. It's like, well, if we had a bunch of large vehicles and people were driving them with like the knowledge, this is more dangerous, I need to be more careful. But that's really not happens at all. It's the same as everyone else, where everyone's just trying to like beat everyone and shave 11 seconds off their trip come hell or high water.
Well, okay, so I thought about that in context to later you ring up speed governors, which is maybe the coolest thing I've heard about in terms of smart city potential tech. Um, and can you talk a little bit about speed governors? Because that was totally new to me.
Yeah, so we have like we totally have the technology where we could just prevent cars from speeding. Like we pay these police officers, right? Like whatever they make a year, plus their pension, plus the cost to outfit those cars, which is extremely expensive. And then we send them out to have these high stakes interactions with people where people end up dead and there's lawsuits. But we could just limit the technology is available. In fact, so my husband and I bought a new car last year, and it just comes with a speed governor, but it's not, you have to set it yourself. You have to decide. So we limited ours at like 75 or something. But anyway, we don't use that at all though in the United States. Like even there was recently a push to at least speed govern 18 wheelers like on highways. I think it would have been to 65. And, you had testimony in Congress from tearful parents who lost their children in these kind of crashes with these commercial drivers speeding, and still Congress would not move on that. They sided with the trucking companies that didn't want to do it. But in Europe, they've taken a very different approach. Europe is much more forward thinking about traffic safety than the United States, and they have much better outcomes. And the European Union is going to go ahead in 2022 and require speed governors in every car. And not only could we mandate speed governors that like top out at 70 or 75 or whatever, we could also, there's using GPS and different things, we could mandate speed governors that conform to the speed limits or close to them. That technology is available right now.
That's super. I think that's very cool. I thought that was a particularly interesting way to think about it. I would love it. I would love to not have the ability to speed. That would be a lovely thing to not have to think about. But the other part of the smart cities argument, and I'm so glad you wrote about it because I wanted to ask about it anyway, was self-driving cars. And that's all the rage. It's a huge topic. Everyone has their opinion on it. But in terms of this particular area of discussion and the topic you're covering, it's really not great.
Well, so it's a little bit complex, but so far the record has not been that awesome. I talk a lot about this case, Elaine Hertzberg. She's the first pedestrian to be killed by a self-driving car. She was killed in Tempe, Arizona a few years ago. And Uber, who was in charge, first of all, the whole testing is entirely unregulated right now. Like the federal government just said like, we hope this works out. Good luck, guys. That's it. And there's some like voluntary reporting they can do, but basically they're just beta testing these cars that could kill people on public streets in places like Arizona and actually a lot of other places around the country. So that's to have it start off that way is not super encouraging, right? And they the people that are promoting self-driving cars have sort of said safety is the moral imperative for self-driving cars. We could potentially, if we had perfectly calibrated computer-driven cars, we could eliminate potentially all of the deaths that happen on our roads, or 90%. But
right.
We don't seem to be at all close to that. They've been promising self-driving cars would be like fully automated cars would be on the road, for different time frames for a long time. But a lot of people who study this now are very skeptical that we're going to see them at all, or, if we do, it may be decades from now. But so that's sort of like the the downside, I would say. But I am actually kind of excited about, there's some technologies that are available right now that have the potential to save a lot of lives. They're just not being as widely deployed or required or embraced as much as they should, in my opinion.
And what are some of those?
So, like a lot of new cars now will come with automatic emergency braking. So they'll just automatically brake if you're about to hit something, right? That's really promising. It there's a lot of evidence that it shows it helps reduce crashes. There's automatic pedestrian detection now in some cars, which is for this issue really promising also. Now, some testing has shown that the systems don't really work that well right now. But part of the problem is that we haven't required them. So, like the federal government hasn't mandated pedestrian detection systems in any cars, and they're only coming in some luxury cars. And basically, an automaker can slap whatever on a car and call it automatic pedestrian braking right now, because there isn't the sort of federal guidance to ensure like a certain level of quality.
Well, that is frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it is one thing. There's like so much, I think there's so much we could do with better auto regulations, better auto safety. It's like things that we take for granted now, like seatbelts and airbags. People actually really fought like tooth and nail for that. Actually,
Sure. Yeah.
airbags went to the Supreme Court.
Right.
The requirement of airbags, and people at the time thought that that's an infringement on our rights or something. But people don't. I don't know, it's sort of unfashionable, and we really don't show up to these fights. And like safety technologies that could save like 4,000 lives a year will be like, I think the Trump administration is sort of quashing one right now, and there's not even really any outcry. No one has even heard of it, sadly.
And what, remind me, what is the number of annual deaths in the U.S. currently?
So it's around like, it sort of depends. Like different agencies do different estimates, but it's
Sure.
like around 40,000. And then pedestrian deaths, which was the focus of this book, it's like 6,200 a year. People are killed.
6,200 a year.
Yeah, but it's like compared to like, if you think about, like, to put it in perspective, so only like 3,000, 3,500 people die in fires in the United States every year. So like we have fire departments, and like the amount of like fire safety personnel, which is it's sort of a success story. In every city and town and hamlet, we have this fire department to prevent these fire deaths. And then for pedestrians, it's just like there's really nothing. There's not really even infrastructure in place to promote, in a lot of cases, to promote better outcomes.
But there are some people doing advocacy. I mean, obviously, you are now very much in the forefront of that, and I'm very excited for the book to kind of generate a lot more conversation about this. But there are other folks that have been doing this work also, and you talk about a couple, and PEDS is one of them, and then Families for Safe Streets is another. You talk a little bit about the work that they're doing.
Yeah. So there are a few bike and pedestrian advocacy organizations in cities around the country. It's pretty limited. They don't have a lot of funding, but there is more and more interest in it. So one of the groups I'm excited about is this group, Families for Safe Street, which is founded in New York by families who had lost loved ones in car wrecks, like parents who had lost children, a woman who had lost her husband. They sort of band together and thought, like, we're going to fight back to prevent these kind of deaths and injuries from happening in New York. And now I think it's a really promising trend. There's a number of chapters. I don't even know the latest. There's 11 or 12 chapters in places all around the country, and that's the kind of people who are sort of getting together I think if so many people are impacted by this issue in the United States, it's just like millions of families are sort of devastated because in addition to all the deaths, there's so many injuries. Of course, there's a range, but like life altering injuries are happening all the time as well. But it hasn't been like thought of as a political issue, right? It's just sort of like something that happens or an act of God. But in a lot of cases, I think it is. There's like deliberate decisions that are being made that, a certain amount of deaths is an acceptable price to pay for cheaper cars or faster delivery of goods on the highways or, slightly shorter commutes. We're making those decisions all the time. But people who suffer the consequences might not even realize it.
Right. And the other part of it is the design of places is absolutely not just with this issue, but with every issue, um, paramount, right? I mean, the design of your
Hmm.
physical environment is the most important thing. And to contrast that, taking Cleveland versus Fort Myers, Florida,
Right.
and having the conversation that places that were built post air conditioning um, are designed post Federal Highway Act, right? And so
Yeah.
they're designed to be for cars first in a lot of instances. That happens to be mostly southerly and westerly,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. So, like the Sun Belt region of the United States is the most dangerous for pedestrians, in particular, Florida. Florida is like really a disaster for pedestrians. Like Smart Growth America will rank the most dangerous metro areas for pedestrians, and
Hmm.
like the 9 of the top 10 will be in Florida. And so places like Phoenix, places like Florida, and yeah, like you said, the places that developed after the rise of air conditioning developed sort of in the height of this suburbanization, auto era, and the street design and the land use is so suburban. It ends up being those end up being really hostile places to walk.
And so, with that, I want to talk a little bit about what is next, like how to advocate better as an individual, um, and then a little bit about what you're doing. So you have this book that is out now, and then everyone should go buy it. I will link to all of these things. And you also started and recently announced that you're going to be doing consulting around, well, this very specific topic. You talk a little
Right.
bit about that.
Yeah. So it wasn't like my intention when I started writing the book to do that. It was actually I'm like a pretty impulsive person. So I don't think I had like a clear I was like, I'm gonna write a book, but I don't think I had like a clear end game
Sure.
really. But when I was researching it, I was reading books about traffic safety, and I'm just like really passionate about traffic safety. I think traffic safety is considered so unsexy, and it's just like I don't think it's the most important issue all the time, right? Like right now, we're dealing with so many issues that are
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
pressing. It's just overwhelming, but I do think it's more important than it deserves more attention than it gets, right? Like we could save a lot of lives, reduce a lot of human misery if we could do a better job on traffic safety. Actually, like if we could do as well as Canada does in the United States on traffic safety, about 20,000 lives a year would be saved. So, like Canada manages a country that's similar in a lot of ways, manages to do twice as well as us on this. So anyway, one of the things I read about was pedestrian safety audits. And so, like I mentioned earlier, I think we're missing all these pieces that are needed to keep people safe. And that a little bit, it depends on the local conditions, what they are. So I'm excited about this idea of pedestrian safety audits, which is just you go out, let's say you have a problem corridor in your region that's been identified, or potentially I could help you um, sort of figure out where the problem corridors are. Then you get people together and you walk the street because I think part of the problem with this issue and why it's been overlooked somewhat is the people who are influential in like the media and governments, just in their own communities to a certain extent, usually are privileged enough where they don't find themselves in this position where they're having to wait for a bus next to a 10-lane road in Florida, right?
Right.
Like if you can afford a car, you can sort of opt out of that. And I think that there's some higher income people that do some walking, but they tend to be like in sort of sweet spots, like, gentrified areas of Boston and stuff. So they're not like really being exposed to the most difficult conditions. So anyway, getting people from the community to experience the street, like from what it's like at the bus stop, at the sidewalk, and then just to talk to some people that are users about what are the problems, what are the deficiencies, is one of the things I'm sort of excited about, and that's why I wanted to try and get involved after doing this in implementing some changes, because there's a lot of work to be done. And
Absolutely.
one thing about that kind of work is it's relatively inexpensive compared to, again, like I said, these big highway projects, which have been sort of the focus, like the state DOTs and stuff that have the real money, the real federal money, have really been sort of focused on, okay, where's the next highway we can widen at the cost of whatever, infinity, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Almost, that's sort of how it seems. But then one of the sad things is if you wanted to do something like add a pedestrian island somewhere, which the federal government says can reduce these kind of crashes by 35%, they may cost just a few $1,000s, but it becomes like a question of where is that coming from, and it's not quite as automatic. So that's sort of my idea about, I would like to get out in communities that have an interest in it and try to help them. But I think more generally, not everyone can hire me or hire a consultant. I do think like the biggest thing, obviously, is about road design, right?
Right.
Um, I think if we can sort of reframe the way we think about this a little bit, and just even doing things like tuning in and, we're still sort of in the like winning hearts and minds phase, which is why I thought maybe writing a book could help with that a little bit, and doing things like this, where we can get people to sort of think critically about it and try to imagine how things could be a little fairer and a little better. And if we could do a better job on our streets, and if we could have some like reasonable restraints on car design, not only, could we avoid these really tragic things that are happening, we could also have more freedom ourselves to be in a position to walk and, travel a little bit more like that in a healthy way.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. Thank you so much. I think what you've done with this book is incredibly important. And I'm super grateful that you took the time to write it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you. I'm so happy you read it. And I think this is great. We'll see if people are interested.
I'm sure. And, I think from my perspective, you're right. This was not something that I thought about a whole lot. Um, and I think that this is a good moment in time, especially with what's going on in the world and how much chaos there is, and how many more people are at home experiencing their own environments, um, for the first time, maybe really on foot, as they just try
Yeah.
to be outside in some capacity. And I'm hopeful that this is another one of those small silver linings that come from this horrible mess that we're in, uh, is that people have the time to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see. We'll see. It's all pretty upsetting.
It is, it is all aggressively upsetting, uh,
Yeah.
but we'll get through it.
Well,
Probably,
yeah.
hopefully.
Hopefully. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again.
Yes, of course. Thank you. And I will make sure that all of the information, is there anywhere that people should go to find out what you're up to now after they read this book and want to follow
Oh,
you?
yeah. So, well, the website for my business, it's called 3MPH, 3MPHplanning.com. If you just Google, like Island Press is the publisher of the book. If you just Google right away, it should be available on Amazon or through the publisher, Island Press. Again, Right Away is the name of the book. If you want, anyone who's listening can have a 20% discount if they use as a discount code my last name, Schmitt, SCHMITT.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Bye, Angie.
Bye.
Thanks again to Angie and the fine folks at Island Press for offering listeners a 20% discount on the book when they use the code Schmitt. That's SCHMITT over at islandpress.org. We'll link all that in the show notes. That's it for this episode. Again, I'm Jack Storey, and thanks for listening. If you found this conversation to be worthy of your time, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss another episode. Take care and see you next time.